Karen Tully reporting from the meeting for the Republican Women of Baltimore County, and we have Commissioner Richard Rothschild with us today, who is a CRT expert, and CRT often equals white privilege. You wrote some of these things, I think, 7 years ago, and you're seeing them come to fruition. You're like a political prophet in many ways.
I've been accused of being a political prophet too. In fact, I remember I was being interrogated about something, and a Democratic lawyer said, well, maybe Rich just sees things 5 years ahead of the rest. But yeah, I started opposing this theology back in 2015.
The other thing I liked, you began your presentation was, do not accept what I say. Look for the statistics, which is something that the Republican women are trying to do. Get out the information and let you determine for yourself. I apologize for all my notes. You just had such a wealth of information. I'm going to have to look at my notes while I talk to you, okay? The first thing is, you said that the Founding Fathers are being defined as racist today. Could you address that, please?
Yes, there's a very troubling storyline taught by our public schools, and it goes like this. Why would you respect the Constitution when it was just written by a bunch of racist slaveholders? If they're not worthy of respect, why should you respect the Constitution? Unfortunately, that story is completely incorrect, because the vast majority of our Founding Fathers did everything they could in their power, within limits, to abolish slavery.
You talked about the Bill of Rights. You actually mentioned someone local, Carol. I think he was. Sorry.
Carol?
Yes. He was one of the.
Oh, Charles Carroll.
Charles Carroll.
Charles
yes.
Carroll. Carroll County was named after Charles Carroll. Well, Charles Carroll, Benjamin Rush, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, John Witherspoon, they all had written, we've got records, historical records showing that they realized that slavery was wrong and they were trying to abolish it, but they ran into all types of opposition and difficulties. And I'd like to say that, the time wasn't right. If they had tried to abolish slavery, we would have, during their times, we would have had a civil war before we had a revolutionary war.
Yeah, the Declaration of Independence is something that everyone should study. You mentioned the acid test, which is to replace the word black for white.
Yes, it's easy. Sometimes we fool ourselves. It's difficult sometimes to tell whether things like white privilege theory or critical race theory, whether it's legitimate or whether it's racist. And I tell people, here's the acid test. Just change the word white to black, or black to white, or Christian to Jew, or Jew to Christian. And if in inverting the language, it would sound like racism to you, then it is. Okay? Because if something that's not racist should be race neutral.
And you also mentioned, and I've heard this many times, that this is not only hurting white children and their self-esteem, making them feel less, making them feel racist, but it's not good for black children to be stereotyped.
That's right, Karen. I mean, critical race theory, in my opinion, is a form of child abuse. It teaches white children to be self-loathing and feel guilty about their heritage, even though it's a brilliant heritage, one worth being proud of. And it disempowers black children by teaching them that they're helpless victims. If you teach someone they're a helpless victim and there's no hope for them, you're abusing them. You're taking away their hope. You're taking away their optimism. And the funny thing is, when I talk about this kind of thing in front of black audiences, the usual response is I get that they hug me. They thank me. It restores their hope.
There's a lot of black organizations that are standing up against CRT. They feel like, why are you starting this trouble? We have come a long way.
Well, we have come a long way, and the fact that America is imperfect is not an excuse to demagogue everything. The fact of the matter is, our Constitution is not obsolete. And as I already mentioned in my presentation, the Bill of Rights is more relevant now than ever before because it prevents government from doing all kinds of bad things to you when it's being led by politicians that you may or may not like.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, and with respect to our Founding Fathers, you have to paint if you're going to teach our children about them, then teach the whole picture. Teach them that Panel 3 on the Jefferson Memorial, Jefferson is quoted as saying, nothing is more certainly written in the book of faith than that these people are to be free. I mean, we need to tell our children that. To suggest that Thomas Jefferson was this horrible man and somehow suggest that he embraced slavery happily is not true. He was conflicted, as were many of our Founding Fathers. And even Benjamin Franklin became the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. John Adams, he said, I've never owned slaves and I never will. Many of our Founding Fathers made it very clear publicly that they absolutely opposed slavery.
And the other thing is the simple pioneering people that came here were just very simple pioneering people trying to escape an intolerant government to begin with.
Well, that's right. People came here First off, slavery was all over the world in the 1700s. Let's remember, America didn't invent slavery. I tell people, tongue-in-cheek, if you want to go protest the King of England. He's the one that forced it on the colonies against the will of many of our leaders. And second off, our people came here for freedom. They wanted freedom from being forced to embrace the Church of England and pay taxes to it, and they wanted freedom, period. They didn't want overreaching government.
Exactly, and a lot of them were persecuted for that also, for fighting for freedom. One other quick question, let's move a little bit to economics. You state that capitalism is not associated with racism.
No, trying to tie capitalism to racism is like trying to suggest that hot fudge sundaes are the reason for obesity. I mean, it's not true. Capitalism has some moral advantages of other economic systems, and it can best summarize with one simple phrase. In general, it's an absence of coercion. I don't have to buy this microphone from you for $10 unless it feels good to me, and you don't have to sell it to me unless it feels good to you. In other economic systems, some third party's telling you what you should pay and what you should buy and what you should sell and how much you should pay. Capitalism, generally speaking, is an absence of coercion.
If you had to say one thing now to say to the people for the children, so that we stop the children being indoctrinated, what would you tell parents to look out for? What would you tell parents to do?
I would tell parents to recognize, first off, we have created a vacuum in this country, a vacuum in our children's hearts and minds. If you don't imbue our children with the concepts of freedom and why our founding fathers were generally good men and women and why our Constitution is a good document, explain in specificity why, then you create a vacuum. And when you create a vacuum, anything sounds good. Marxism, communism, humanism, secularism, atheism. We need to start teaching our children values again, and not the values, attitudes, and beliefs that the school educrats want to teach them, which is based on nothing more than left-wing political correctness.
Which is meaning putting the right people on the board. And you mentioned something, and I'll conclude with this, because when you stated it, it reminded me of you. You said if someone is going to run for government, ask them if they've ever done anything brave. And I want to commend you, Mr. Rothschild, for your bravery and for standing up for this country. You mentioned the word political apologetics. It'd be great to hear a book on that, or to have sessions where we can actually teach adults a quick way to defend our democracy.
Well, you and I have talked briefly about that, and I've indicated I'm willing to have more dialogue with possibly producing some things that parents could share with their children, Karen. So I'm open to that possibility.
And I want to say this sincerely. God bless and protect you.
Thank you, Karen. Same to you. Thanks for the interview.